Based on our own research, we bring you this latest news from the trawler world. On June 4th of this year, at a factory in Kaohsiung, Taiwan, Nordhavn launched hull number one of a boat it hadn't built in over 20 years. Exactly 2 days later, one of its oldest rivals, a company that had been building trawlers since 1977, filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in a Delaware courtroom and ceased to exist. Same week, same market, completely opposite outcomes. And if you think that's the whole story, it isn't even the most interesting part, because while all of that was happening, a different Nordhavn model that almost nobody wanted 3 years ago has quietly become the hardest boat in the company's lineup to actually buy. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why one long-range cruising builder is having its strongest year in decades at the exact moment a legendary competitor disappeared, and why that isn't a coincidence, it's a pattern. Let's start with the boat that just hit the water, then work outward into the numbers that explain why this company keeps winning. The boat is the Nordhavn 46 Mk2, and the story behind it starts 37 years ago at that same South Coast factory. In 1989, Pacific Asian Enterprises, Nordhavn's parent company, launched the original Nordhavn 46, designed by a young naval architect named Jeff Leishman, essentially as his graduation project, inspired by North Sea fishing trawlers. That single boat invented an entire category. The first full displacement powerboat marketed as a go-anywhere ocean crosser for a retired couple. Between 1989 and 2003, PAE built 82 of them, and to this day, more Nordhavn 46 have crossed oceans and circumnavigated the globe than any other production motor yacht in history. So when the company announced in late 2025 that it was bringing the 46 back after more than 2 decades away, that wasn't a nostalgia project. That was the company returning to the boat that built the category and rebuilding it with everything learned from nearly 700 ocean-going hulls since. And the new boat is not a light refresh. The single biggest change is the one that had owners' forums arguing the moment renderings leaked. The 46 Mk2 runs twin diesels, instead of the original's single main engine and backup wing engine. For decades, that single engine plus wing setup was practically doctrine at Nordhavn. The new boat throws it out, running twin 135 horsepower diesels through independent gears, which means losing one engine mid-ocean doesn't mean crawling home on a limp auxiliary, it means continuing on a full second engine. PAE Vice President Jim Leishman has called the 46 Mk2 simply the most capable, efficient, and comfortable Nordhavn under 50 feet the company has ever built. Underneath that claim is real engineering. The hull is only about 6 inches longer overall than the original, but its waterline is stretched more than 6 feet longer by pulling the bow and stern nearly plumb, which increases hull speed, smooths the motion in a seaway, and lets the boat carry 30% more fuel capacity without losing its trim. It was also the first Nordhavn 46 ever designed entirely with in-house computational fluid dynamics instead of physical tank testing. There's a real casualty in that redesign too, and traditionalists have noticed. The Portuguese bridge, that waist-high bulwark wrapped around the pilot house that's arguably the single most iconic visual signature of a Nordhavn, is gone. Chief designer Jeff Leishman has said keeping it would have dramatically shrunk the interior on a boat this size, and that interior volume had to win. Jim Leishman insists you'll still recognize it as a Nordhavn at a glance, but he's openly acknowledged the salty North Sea look belongs to a different era, and that the buyers signing checks in 2026 skew younger, live aboard full-time, and would trade the romantic bulwark for a bigger salon every time. When hull number one launched on that Wednesday morning in June, salesman James Leishman, whose own clients are buying that first hull, called it a pretty historic milestone, noting that 37 years after the original 46 first splashed at that exact factory, the company expects equally exciting things from this one. The boat now heads into sea trials before shipping to Dana Point, California, this summer, where its new owners will train on it and cruise down to Mexico before the year is out. Now here's where the timing turns genuinely strange, because 2 days after that launch, the trawler world lost one of its most respected names. On July 6th, Katie Krogan Yachts, a Rhode Island-based builder that had been designing blue water passage makers since 1977 and had built nearly 700 boats over almost 5 decades, filed a voluntary Chapter 7 petition in the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the District of Delaware. Unlike Chapter 11, where a company reorganizes and keeps operating, Chapter 7 is liquidation. A court-appointed trustee takes control of the company's assets and sells them off to repay creditors. Parent company KKY Holdings and sister brand American Tugs, which Katie Krogan had acquired in 2023, filed alongside it the same day. The court filing lays out the collapse in stark numbers. Gross revenue was roughly $14.9 million in 2024. That fell to about $10.1 million in 2025. By the date of the July filing, 2026 revenue stood at just $403,962, a collapse of more than 90% in under 2 years. Total assets came in around $2.26 million against liabilities of about $2.48 million, and a large share of those assets were molds, tooling, and goodwill, not cash. This wasn't a slow fade, it was a cliff, and it happened to a builder whose boats were genuinely well regarded inside the passage-making community. Not some struggling also-ran everyone expected to fail. So why did one company launch a new hull the same week another one disappeared entirely? Part of the answer sits in a detail buried in the Katie Krogan filing. The company didn't own its own factory. Construction was handled by a third-party yard, Asia Harbor Yacht Builders in Taiwan, while Katie Krogan itself only designed, marketed, and supported the boats. That's a capital-light model when orders are flowing, and a very exposed one when they stop. Nordhavn, by contrast, builds through PAE's own long-term South Coast facility relationship and has spent the last several years moving its smaller models, the 41, the 51, and now the 46 MK2, onto a batch-build approach with a complete, lock specification rather than an open-ended options list. According to the company, only a dinghy and watermaker aren't included standard on the new 46. Everything else, from the electronics down to the finish work, comes with the boat. That structural difference is showing up everywhere else in Nordhavn's lineup this year too, and this is the part of the story that's easy to miss if you only look at the headline launch. And it's worth pausing on the size of the pond all of this is happening in, because the segment itself is not shrinking. Independent market research from Verified Market Reports puts the global recreational trawler market at roughly $3.5 billion in 2025, projected to climb to about $5.9 billion by 2034, a compound annual growth rate north of 6%. Nordhavn, Beneteau, Katie Krogan, Nordic Tugs, Celine, and Bering Yachts are all named among the leading players competing for that same growing pool of buyers. That's the detail that makes the Katie Krogan story so unusual. Companies don't normally collapse from 90% revenue loss inside a market that outside researchers still expect to grow for the next decade. When demand for a category is rising and one builder still implodes, the explanation almost always sits in how that specific company was structured, not in whether people still want the product. Take the Nordhavn 71 as the clearest example of that structural difference in action. When it first came out, the design and engineering team at PAE was genuinely puzzled by its slow start. The first 3 hulls sold reasonably fast, but hulls 4 and 5 sat waiting for buyers for a while. That's no longer the situation. Hull number 5 was recently delivered to its owners in California. Hulls 6 through 9 are already under contract. Hulls 10 through 14 are reserved. And the next hull actually available for a new buyer is number 15. One of those buyers, a former sport fishing owner named Jeff Snow, wanted more speed than the standard 71 offered, so Chief of Design Jeff Leishman extended the cockpit by 4 feet and stretched the waterline, and that redesign became an entirely new model, the Nordhavn 77. A boat that once struggled to sell became successful enough to spawn its own larger sibling. The pattern repeats up and down the range. The Nordhavn 100, a model the company has offered for nearly a decade, just got a second evolution called Safe Passage, adding more interior volume and longer decks by reworking the same hull that originally produced the fishing-focused Nordhavn 96 series. The Nordhavn 80 has hull number 5 nearing completion at the South Coast Yard, having already passed tank testing. None of these are separate, unrelated announcements. They're the same design team running one continuous engineering program across the entire top end of the range, where a change proven on one hull quietly shows up on the next one a few years later. And the company isn't shy about what 2025 looked like heading into all of this. According to Nordhavn's own year-end review, 2025 produced one of the highest dollar volumes of brokerage sales in the company's history, and the Distance Pennant program, which tracks ocean miles logged by Nordhavn owners, crossed past 8.7 million nautical miles. Senior project manager Trevor Smith described 2026 as already shaping up to be an exciting year, pointing to new launches, new designs, and what he called stronger boats and a stronger team than ever. This September, the Nordhavn Owners Rendezvous heads to the Port of Everett in Washington State, following an April rendezvous already held in Georgetown, Exuma, in the Bahamas. Those gatherings matter more than they sound like they should, because a used Nordhavn market that stays liquid and a fleet that keeps showing up to the same events year after year is exactly the kind of owner loyalty that turns a boat purchase into a community decision. None of this means Nordhavn is invulnerable, and it's worth being honest about the parts of this story that are still open questions rather than settled facts. Jim Leishman himself has acknowledged that new Nordhavn designs routinely cost more to build than the company originally hoped, meaning pricing on models like the 46 Mk2 will likely climb as more hulls are built, the same pattern seen on past launches. The broader trawler segment that swallowed Katie Krogan whole, tariff uncertainty on boats built in Taiwan, a post-2020 buying surge that has cooled, a buyer base shifting younger and pickier, hasn't gone anywhere, and it will test every builder in this category over the next few years, Nordhavn included. A private, family-influenced company like PAE doesn't publish the kind of quarterly financials that would let us check its numbers the way we can with a publicly traded builder. So most of what we know about its momentum comes from the company's own releases, dealer waitlists, and independent trade coverage rather than audited filings. And a market projected to grow at 6% a year over the next decade will not stay short on competition forever. The same growth numbers that explain why Katie Krogan's collapse is so strange are also the reason new builders and new capital will keep circling this segment, waitlist or not. What we can say for certain is this. In the same week, one of American boat building's oldest trawler names ran out of hulls to sell, Nordhavn launched a boat it had spent nearly 2 years re-engineering from the keel up, watched a once slow-selling flagship turn into a 15-hull waitlist, and rolled out fresh iterations of its 80, its 100, and its 46 all inside a single year, while its owners kept showing up, rendezvous after rendezvous, from the Bahamas in April to Washington State in September, to a brand that most of them will go on to buy from twice. That's not luck showing up once. That's a pattern showing up across an entire product line, an entire owner base, and an entire calendar year at once. So tell me in the comments, is this the strongest era in Nordhavn's history? Or are we watching one well-run builder simply outlast a shrinking field before its own reckoning arrives? And if you had a deposit sitting with any long-range cruising builder right now, would this week's news make you feel safer or more nervous? I'll be tracking what happens to the Katie Krogan molds under the bankruptcy trustee, and if a buyer emerges for those assets, you'll hear it here first. Until then, keep your fuel polished and your options open.